From crisis to coup to condemnation, Yemen's Houthi rebels complete their political power grab, drawing protests at home and rebukes abroad. But will the takeover help restore stability or fuel further chaos? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Foliba Thibault. After months of tightening their grip, Houthi rebels have asserted their political control of Yemen. The Shia group has proclaimed a formal takeover, hailing what it called a new era that will take Yemen to safe shores. Rebels overran the capital Sana'a in September. Faltering talks with Yemen's political factions failed to resolve the standoff that followed, leading to Friday's unilateral declaration. The group says it intends to set up a 551-member national council to replace the existing parliament. A 5-member presidential council will then form a transitional government for 2 years.
The Yemeni people have earned the right to lead a dignified, free life. The Yemeni people are worthy of obtaining their demands and rightful wants. The historic, significant moment taken by our people yesterday represented in the constitutional declaration of a significant step forward.
Well, questions are now being raised about how the Houthis managed to seize power. The group adheres to a branch of Shia Islam known as Zaydism. It makes up around a third of Yemen's population and effectively ruled the north until 1962. The latest rebellion dates back to 2004. Houthi rebels consolidated power during the 2011 revolution, which saw the fall of longtime leader President Ali Abdullah Saleh and the appointment of his deputy Al-Araby Mansour Hadi. And since then, the Houthis had been pressing their demand for greater autonomy and political representation, culminating in Friday's coup. Now, critics maintain that the Houthis are funded and supported by Iran, something both deny, and that former President Saleh has been orchestrating the rebel uprising. So a lot to discuss then. Let's bring in our guests for today's show. In Yemen's capital, Sana'a, we have Sarah Jamal, a sociologist and researcher of transitional justice. In London, Abu Bakr al-Shamahi, a journalist at Al-Araby, Al-Jadeed, and editor of CommentMideast.com. And also in Sana'a is Hisham Al-Omeisy, a political activist and co-founder of the newly established Al-Watan Party. Thank you all for being on the program today. Sarah in Sana'a, if may begin with you. So the Houthis have staged periodic uprisings since 2004, but they were never actually able to get to the point they are today. I mean, as recently as just a few weeks ago, the true extent of their ambition was not clear. So what do you think changed? What was it, or perhaps who was it that made this power grab possible?
This is a normal result of the way the international community dealt with Yemen. Houthis started as advocates for a certain cause in an area that lacked basic needs and infrastructure in Sada, North Yemen. And they were faced with 6 brutal wars that simply bombarded those areas that already lack the basics without any serious investigation that can build a road towards real transitional justice. And they did join the uprisings in 2011, and they chose to remain nonviolent back then. But ever since the GCC initiative was signed, and in spite of the fact that they took part of the National Dialogue Conference, their acts on the ground were different.
So they had a lot of issues. Let me get Hisham to talk about his view here on this. Hisham, you know, there are a lot of people who see the hand of the former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, in all this, in what's happened in the last 24 hours or so, in the last few weeks, in fact. What are your thoughts?
Okay, Ali Abdullah Saleh, he is not involved directly as a party or as a person, but he is involved through the Republican Guards, which through the restructuring of the army by the GCC initiative, of course, they disintegrated the army, one of the strongest units, which was a big mistake. Those people need to be paid. Those people owe allegiances to people on the GPC, and which is really close to the Houthis. Houthis exploited that fact, employed them, and those guys eased the Houthis' entry into Sana'a and other areas. Now, going back to your earlier question about what caused the Houthi rise, let's not forget that the government was a total failure. Let's not forget that after 2011, there was much more corruption than before it. Let's not forget that, like Sarah mentioned correctly, that there was like 20 points that were supposed to be resolved before any negotiations. They were totally ignored. Houthis were marginalized. They exploited that. They exploited the grievances of the public, of the rampant corruption, of the government failure, and that led to the takeover of Sana'a and other governorates as well by the Houthis.
Okay, Abu Bakr in London, Iran has been accused of giving financial and military support to the Houthis, which they've both denied. Do you see any outside involvement in what's happened in Yemen?
Well, I'm sure there's some sort of support coming from Iran, but I mean, we've got to remember the Houthis are an organic movement that have emerged out of Yemeni society. They've emerged out of the conditions that exist in Yemeni society and in the Yemeni political scene, as Hisham and Sarah have both mentioned. And so, although there may be these international players that are getting involved, whether they be Iran, whether it be Saudi Arabia, or any other state in the region, but it's important, I mean, not to take away the agency of the Houthi movement as a movement who've exploited the conditions on the ground to achieve their goals and to roll into the capital.
Right. Well, the coup in Yemen has drawn condemnation at home and from international backers as well. Protesters in the southwestern city of Taiz took to the streets, refusing to accept the announcement, saying that the demonstrations marked the beginning of a new revolution. Political groups have also voiced their concern.
The constitutional declaration announced by the Houthi group is from one side, which ensures that the situation in Yemen is heading towards a new conflict, and majority of Yemeni parties, from political parties or social groups, reject what has been announced. Those who attended the gathering don't represent the southern, Taiz and Tahama areas. They were just marginal.
The U.S. has rejected the takeover. A State Department spokesman said any political solution to the current crisis must be based on the broad consensus of all Yemeni stakeholders. And the UN expressed grave concern and said it was ready to take what it called further steps, which it's understood could include new sanctions. And Gulf foreign ministers meeting U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry called on the international community to take a stronger position on Yemen. So, Hisham, before we talk about the international implications and the regional implications, let's talk about what's happening inside Yemen itself. There have been reports of protests in several cities, including in Sana'a. The Houthis are in control of the capital, of course, but not of the entire country. Just how difficult do you think it's going to be for them to win national support?
Well, here's the thing. People are fed up of protests. People are fed up of the current status quo. Even when it's very true that there's a lot of independent folks who went to the street protesting against the Houthis. But let's not forget that a lot of people in 2011, when they joined the streets, they were blamed. They were accused of being Islah. They were accused of being politicized, and hence left the field, left it to the political parties. The GCC initiative solidified that. They dealt with the political parties, not the independent youth. So now that it came around for a second round of protests, there is a lot of people and a lot of youth, they don't want to join the protests. They don't want to protest against the Houthis or anybody else for that matter. So you see these protests against the Houthis are very small numbers, not because people are welcoming the Houthis, but because there's a huge sense of apathy.
Sarah, what has life been like for civilians in Sana'a? And, are people hopeful that the Houthis will finally bring greater stability to Yemen?
I don't know. I mean, first of all, allow me to question people. I don't think that people were hopeful about a group, a militia that came to their city with weapons. I mean, this is to begin with. People in September were very astonished. They were shocked. Of course, Houthis have supporters who cheered for them. But at the end of the day, that was an intense armed conflict that replaced formal security forces on the street with militiamen in civilian clothes. Some of them are minors, under 16 years old, 14 at times, with Kalashnikovs guarding checkpoints and stopping citizens to search their cars instead of security forces. And later on, after they stole weapons from camps, they also stole uniforms. And I personally witnessed them in ministries and even in the central prison in Sana'a, one of the most important security institutions, guarded by minors in security uniforms. But in the past 2 weeks, I mean, ever since President Hadi and the government resigned, it's very interesting to say that aside from the protests that happen in certain geographical areas, Sana'a is a relevantly big city, and in the other sides where nothing is happening, people are really working hard to maintain a normal lifestyle.
Is it because people are afraid to go out? Or after, sorry, Sarah, is it because people are afraid of the Houthis, are afraid to go out, or is it simply because there's some sort of, protest fatigue among Yemenis, perhaps?
No, quite the contrary. People are going to work. I mean, even today, I mean, the next day after the coup declaration, people go to work, people still go to the markets, and they're trying to maintain a normal life in spite of the armed existence on the street. And my only explanation is that the state was absent, so it wasn't even missed when the president resigned. Are people scared? Of course they are, but they're scared of what is worse than now. People tend to normalize with the militia on the street as long as they can be relatively safe going to work and going to school and so on. People are worried and scared of the next armed conflict, but in the meanwhile, they're trying really hard to maintain a normal lifestyle.
So people trying to maintain a normal lifestyle. Abu Bakr, as minority Shias from the north, the authority of the Houthis is likely not to be accepted by people in the south. I mean, there have been growing call for secession in the south. Do you think the spectre of actual secession is even more real today after the Houthis have taken power?
I think it's definitely more real. And I think the reason for that is more to do with the breakdown of the state and the increased possibility of the South being able to secede. Having said that, the South will not be able to secede, in my view, unless they have the military strength to do that and some sort of international support, especially from regional states. I think the southern opposition to the Houthis, yes, there is the sectarian element, and we can't deny that, but it's also to do with simple regional identities. So the Southerners will be opposed to the Houthis, and not just the Southerners, people in Marib, for example, because they see them as people from other areas who are coming into their areas and simply are invaders. So it's not so much that they think, oh, the Houthis, these guys are Zaydis, and therefore we will not accept them taking power. It's that they're simply people from a different area, and how dare they try and assume control over us.
What about Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Abu Bakr? I mean, there were fears that Al-Qaeda in Yemen could make new gains because of the power vacuum, the political vacuum that we've seen. Do you think that this Houthi takeover will weaken or strengthen Al-Qaeda?
In my opinion, local, I think Sarah mentioned that the state has generally been essentially non-existent in many parts of Yemen for the last couple of years, and local power structures have always been quite strong. So if you look at some of the areas now where the state have simply abandoned these villages and towns, local structures have replaced them, and local tribal structures, local urban structures have replaced them, and they've actually made it harder, perhaps in some areas, for Al-Qaeda to take advantage. The flip side is that the increased sectarian tone that now exists when discussing Yemen and inside the country itself gives a chance for Al-Qaeda to accuse the Yemeni state and the Yemeni government of being this pro-Iranian Shia government, and therefore the Al-Qaeda will be the ones to defend the Sunnis, and although I don't think they'll be able to get much support that way, it certainly is a way for them to increase their recruitment and their ability to recruit disaffected young people.
Hisham in Sana'a, do you agree with that? Do you think that this coup could potentially lead to Al-Qaeda getting more support? And also, do you see what the plan is for the Houthis as far as, what they say is bringing Yemen to new shores? Because until a few weeks ago, again, their ambitions weren't very clear. Their aim wasn't clear-cut. They wanted to return to the old constitution at one point. They wanted the fuel subsidies reinstated. Is it clear today what their plan is to move Yemen forward?
Here's the thing that has been pretty much clear for an average Yemeni, but not exactly to the international community. The Houthis, from the onset, refused to be part of the government. That's why they refused to assign ministers or have ministerial candidates under their control. The Houthis, from the onset, wanted to become the regime, not the government. They want to control the government by being the regime. That's one thing. I just wanted to go back to what Sarah said. In terms of security, the average Yemeni is not afraid for his life. Its daily life is normal. He goes on the street. Yemen is armed. People are armed. This is quite normal for us. What the average Yemeni fears is, can I find food? Can I put bread on my table today? And with the rocketing unemployment, with jobs closing, businesses closing, that's what he fears most. Not the incursion of militants on the street. We're quite used to people having guns on the street. Not as now, of course, not as the Houthis now, especially as Sarah mentioned, kids are actually having low rockets, RPGs, 14-year-old carrying an RPG. That's not very comforting.
Right.
And going back to Abu Bakr and Al-Qaeda, you'll definitely see a stronger Al-Qaeda now. If you've noticed, there's been a much rhetoric from GCC countries, from GCC clerics, from GCC religious leaders, trying to support the Sunnis for an uprising against the heathen Shiites. They'll be sending money from the GCC, from the ulama, from Kuwait, from Saudi Arabia, and we've seen it. You could see it all over social media, giving support and money for those people. We have Saudi members of Al-Qaeda, we have Kuwaiti members of Al-Qaeda, we even have Somalian members of Al-Qaeda coming over to Yemen now to support them against the Shiites. So you'll see a resurgence of Al-Qaeda.
Abu Bakr, I think you want to jump in. I want to ask you about this point that he just made, but also, how do you see Saudi Arabia, the new regional, the regional power rather, how do you see it dealing with the new Yemen? Because Saudi Arabia had, before the Houthis officially declared that they were in power, had already stopped sending money, a lot of its financial support to Yemen. How will they deal now with Yemen now that the Houthis are effectively in control?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on Hisham's point, I agree that the one thing here that the local kind of regional actors from Saudi, from these states, preachers, etc., they have attempted to present what's going on in Yemen as this existential sectarian battle between Sunnis and Shias that people on the ground simply, a lot of them simply don't see. But because of their ability to use media, to use traditional media and social media to kind of foment this sectarianism on the ground, we're starting to see it. On the point of Saudi Arabia, I think the Saudis, their main concern with regards to their southern neighbor is security and their own security. If they believed that the regime in Yemen would be able to provide them with security and ensure their security, they would work with it. Their issue with the Houthis now is that, I think they're in two minds about that, about whether they're potentially better than other actors, but at the same time they do see them as this pro-Iranian group who will be dangerous on their border. I think they have stopped bankrolling the Yemeni government and the Yemeni state, and that's going to be a severe problem for the Houthis now, because now that they've assumed essentially the role of the government, how are they going to pay for wages? And without Saudi money, that's going to be a severe problem for them.
Exactly. Sarah, do you agree with that? I mean, without the Saudi money, the Houthis are in a very delicate position today. How do you think they're going to handle this? How are they going to be able to govern if they're not able to pay people?
Well, the Houthis are in a hole of problems, not only because of that, but that's a very urgent question that the average Yemeni is asking on the street for weeks now, even before yesterday. and people are literally thinking of the February salaries, especially when a Houthi representative appeared on television a couple of days ago and sort of went around the question and spoke about the oil subsidies and implied going back to the former government's plan that they claimed to revolt against in the first place, because that's the only way they can manage. But yes, absolutely, I strongly agree with Abu Bakr and Hisham on this point. If Houthis are in charge this month and this international and regional exclusion and boycott for the rule in Yemen continues, Houthis will not be able to afford salaries in February. And their way to be one step ahead of this is talking about corruption, which leads me to a very important point that takes me back to your earlier question about the daily life. They're trying to be one step ahead by saying that they're fighting corruption and sending their armed militiamen in ministries and public sector institutions to see who's present and who's not, in order to justify cutting some salaries and cutting off some of the governmental employees. But I would also like to point out something on the whole sectarian proxy in the Yemeni scene. I still think that this is not exactly a sectarian conflict. I still believe that the sectarian breath jumping into it takes its legitimacy from the regional conflict happening in other parts of the region. Iraq and Syria are examples. It's important to also think that the Houthi movement has different lines in it. They're not all one mass or one solid mass of the same guy, and they are allies of Saleh. Saleh is a Zaidi president who basically fought them for 6 years in 6 different wars, but now he is their best friends. At the end of the day, this is politics. I don't think we can say that Yemenis are there yet in terms of the sectarian breath. The student movement protesting on the street is not a movement fighting against Houthis for sectarian reasons. It's a movement that fought against militia during General Ali Muhsin's occupation of their university.
So do you think that the sectarian nature of the conflict that we tend to hear sometimes, especially overseas, is exaggerated? Let me just come to you, Hisham, and touch on the relationship with the United States, because that's very important. You know, despite the takeover, the U.S. has said it would continue working with Yemen on counterterrorism, because the U.S. and Yemen have a common enemy, and that's Al-Qaeda, of course. Do you think that this relationship will continue? I mean, the U.S. can't afford not to collaborate with Yemen in the fight against Al-Qaeda.
Remember, there was a lot of talk when the government collapsed, when the president resigned, that the CTU operations would cease. It did not cease. Actually, we saw 3 major drone strikes, right after the cabinet resigned and the president resigned. People have to remember that the coordination between the U.S. and Yemen for the CTU is done with special entities, with specific people, not the cabinet, not the government, not the president directly. He doesn't sign off of everything. They will continue, they will expand. The Houthis are not idiots. They weren't born yesterday. They know this very well. They will use it to their advantage. The drone strike that happened in Marib, Houthis didn't voice any objection to it because it actually helped them. When the US struck in Marib, Al-Qaeda in Marib, that actually played right into the Houthi rhetoric that Marib is full of Al-Qaeda. So they're actually happy with the drone strike. They weren't actually against it. You have to differentiate between their hoorah with the sarkha and anti-US rhetoric and what they would like to cooperate with through the US. That's one thing. The other thing, in terms of salaries, let's not forget that Houthis ruled in Saada for 6 years, from 2004 to 2010. How did they rule that governorate without having control of the state funds? It's because they taxed the people directly. Now in Sana'a, even if the government doesn't pay them, even if they don't get funds from the government, they do tax businessmen, they do tax people, they do tax shops directly, and through that kind of money, fund their own militia or their own people. So they're not going to have a problem with that. They'll run into a problem when they start paying government employee money, which again Okay, go ahead.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you, but we've run out of time. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Sarah Jamal, Abu Bakr Al-Samahi, and Hisham Al-Omeisy. Thank you all for being on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you for joining us. If you've got anything to add to today's show, go to our program page at aljazeera.com. You can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story as well, or send your tweets to @AJ Inside Story. I'm Fuliba Thibault from the whole team. Bye for now.